I'm Anna Bookman. Oh, I think now I'm live. Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in with us today. I'm Anna Bookman, and most people call me Malka around the Jewish community. I present and produce the Eu Com Isso podcast by the Brazil-Israel Institute. I recommend you to start listening to it if you haven't started yet. Today, we have an event co-hosted by the Brazil-Israel Institute and CIPI. I would like to welcome Dr. Micah Goodman. Micah Goodman is a research fellow of the Kogod Research Center at Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He's a leading voice on Judaism, Zionism, the Bible, and the challenges and opportunities facing Israel and contemporary world Jewry. Dr. Goodman has a doctorate in the Jewish in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem on Jewish thought, and he still teaches there. He's also the author of several Israeli bestsellers on canonical Jewish texts. So Moses' Final Speech, The Dream of the Kuzari, and The Secrets of the Guide for the Perplexed, all published in Hebrew. His 2017 book, Catch 67, also rose to the bestseller lists and prompted many discussions about the ramifications of the Six-Day War in its 50th anniversary. Micah, it's great to have you with you. It's great to have you with us today. I read the book in just one day, and I was astounded how easy and involving it was. This book is now available in Portuguese, and the QR code on your screen somewhere is already available to buy. I would also like to thank Guilherme Casarões for being here with us today. Guilherme is a professor at the Getúlio Vargas Foundation's Business School of São Paulo. His research focuses on Brazil-Israel relations, Brazilian foreign policy, and the global rise of the far right. He has been a visiting fellow at Tel Aviv University, Brandeis University, and University of Michigan. I am now going to leave you to Guilherme, who will focus more on the book. And afterwards, I'll come back to bring other questions from our other invitees. Thank you so much.
Hello, Micah. Hello, everyone who's watching us. Thank you so much for your book, Micah, as it's certainly one of the most fascinating, thought-provoking, and timely reads on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and particularly on the Israeli debate on this problem, or Catch 67, as you call it. Readers of the Portuguese version of the book might find it slightly difficult to understand whenever I say Catch 67, because in Portuguese it's been translated to impasse, which is a slightly different, it conveys a slightly different meaning to it. But anyways, you even refer to the novel Catch 22, which has inspired your whole discussion about it. So let us start with your description of the Israeli right and left. You have argued that the Israeli right has moved away from liberalism and secularism and towards messianism and religion. Could you please discuss the origins of this shift and how it has impacted today's Israel? And how does your thesis explain the fact that Israel's largest party, the Likud, as well as its longest standing leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, are still predominantly secular and liberal?
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. And I'm glad to receive such intelligent questions. And I'm diving right into it. By the way, I have a tendency to give long answers, so please feel free to stop me saying Micha, not a lecture, it's an interview. Feel free to stop me. I'm Israeli. You can be okay. So it's very interesting when we look at the origins of the Israeli right. So it's very non-stereotypical, because today when we think about the stereotype of the Israeli right, and you're speaking about the Likud, you're speaking about grassroots, real Israeli right. But the image of Israeli right is more like very religious, messianic, I know that in Brazil you have a growing evangelical movement, if I understand correctly. So I would say the Israeli Jewish version of evangelical thinking, way of thinking. And but when we look at the past, the founding father of the Israeli right, a giant, an intellectual giant called Ze'ev Jabotinsky. This was his vision for Zionism. His vision for Zionism was a combination of three foundations. One, territorial maximalism, which means all of the land of Israel that was granted to the Jewish people after World War I by the international community should be forever Jewish land. Now, many people don't know this, but after World War I, relying on the Balfour Declaration, the land that the international community set apart for the Jewish people, it's called a national home for the Jewish people, included both sides of the Jordan River, which means it includes all of Israel today, including the West Bank, plus what Jordan is today. So Ze'ev Jabotinsky said we should fight for every inch and not give any inch of what the international community promised us. So I find this very interesting, because usually people speak about the land that God promised us. But the founding father of the Israeli right said we should fight not for the land that God promised us, but the land that the international community promised us. So this is very interesting, because usually the right is the side that says we shouldn't care much about the international community. But the founding father of the right said that's the only thing we should care about, that the promise of the international community and not God should be fulfilled. That's one foundation. The second foundation is liberalism. Liberalism in the sense of the sense of human rights. He said that all the people living in the land that was promised to the Jews should have equal rights. And that includes all the Arabs, all the Palestinians living in that land. So he was a maximalist when it comes to territory, and he was a maximalist when it comes to liberalism and to human rights. And the third foundation of Ze'ev Jabotinsky's thought was the politics of suspicion. He was very suspicious when it came to any forces that were not Jewish. He was very, very suspicious regarding the German. He said bad things are going to come from Germany. He was right at the time. He was very, very suspicious when it came to the British. The British were in control of where today Israel is. And he said, and they're the ones that were supposed to implement the promise of the international community to found a Jewish state or a Jewish home in this land. And he said we should be suspicious. The British will turn their back to their promise. And he was very suspicious regarding the Palestinians. He says, very, very early on, there'll be a national rebellion against Zionism. By the way, he was right about all three. So he was very suspicious, very liberal in territorial maximalism. And that was the foundations of Jabotinsky. After the 6-Day War, now this is a long story that I try to describe in this book. It's a long story, the first chapters of the right, of what happened to the Israeli right. But one of the interesting things that happened is that the 6-Day War transformed the Israeli right. And the 6-Day War gave charisma to the evangelical version of the right. They don't call themselves evangelical. No, that's just a way for it to help Brazilian people understand it. The messianic version of the Israeli right. And the reason why the 6-Day War gave charisma to the messianic version of the right, not the liberal version of the right, but the messianic, was because it felt like a miracle. You see, in 6 days, Israel more than triples its size. In 6 days, tiny Israel, scrawny Israel, weak Israel destroys 3 Arab armies backed by the Soviet Union. And it was experienced as a miracle. It was experienced as a miracle, as a biblical miracle. But not only was it experienced as a miracle with biblical dimensions, it brought Israel back to biblical land. Because the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, almost every mountain in Judea and Samaria echoes of biblical events. Hebron was the city of Abraham, and Jerusalem is King David, and everything, every mountain here, there was a prophet or a king or something. So you see, it was a war where a biblical miracle happened that brought us back to biblical land. And it felt like ancient prophecies are becoming a reality. And if ancient prophecies from the Bible are becoming a reality, guess what? It's very possible that the next prophecies are coming back to are going to become a reality, and the Messiah is around the corner. And the 6-Day War gave charisma to not the liberal version of the right, but the messianic version of the right. And now finally, to the second part of your question. The Likud are not very religious. Bibi, some people say he's an atheist. He would never admit that, but like he's not, he's definitely not, on the settler messianic evangelical camp. So I would say the passionate ideology in the right is messianic, even though most right-wingers are not messianic. That seems like a paradox, but like most people on the right, they are very into security, deep admiration for Netanyahu, and they're not very articulate when it comes to their ideology. The clearest ideology comes from the Messianic group. So let me maybe capture this and summarize in the following way. The Messianic group is a minority in the right, but the Messianic ideology has the majority of the passion in the Israeli right. The liberal version of the right lost its numbers and its passion. So I hope it's complicated. I hope that answers your question.
Well, it does. And not only does it answer my question, and thank you very much for that, but it also brings to light a global phenomenon, the one of religious nationalism. So the secular versions of nationalism have moved or have transmuted into something very new. And it's not only in Israel, it's in pretty much every corner of the Western world. So I think that we in Brazil, we're going through this wave of religious nationalism, which is not only represented by evangelicals, but also by Catholics and most pious Brazilians, to put it this way. It's the same in the United States. So I think that this conversion of the Israeli right is actual, it has very Israeli elements to it, but it's also part of a global wave. Maybe Bibi has understood this even before most far-right leaders or right-wing leaders across the world, because he was the first one to wrap Jabotinskian ideals into a messianic package, right?
Yes. Bibi he's probably, I think Bibi is not just Israel's most talented politician. He might be one of the most talented politicians in the world. And he sees trends before it happens and he taps into it in a very effective way. And it's very possible that even though he is not messianic, he's not religious, he saw this happening and he was there to give words to and to be the ally of these forces. And it's interesting. I think the messianic impact of the 6-Day War has faded. I don't think Israelis walk around and feel like Messiah is around the corner. I don't think Israelis on the right feel like the Messiah is around the corner. I don't even feel like Israelis on the religious right feel like Messiah is around the corner. A lot has happened ever since the 6-Day War. And what Israeli scholars call the euphoria, the euphoric moments post-war, where people felt like history is transformed forever, I think that faded away. Mm-hmm. Life has power. History has power. The most crazy things feel normal, right? I mean, think what we are now. When COVID-19 began, we felt like this was the end of the world, and now it feels as crazy as it is, it feels normal suddenly, right? So history has a tendency to normalize almost anything. And I think the impact of 6-Day War faded away, and yet the Messianic group did not lose its power. And that is, I think, because that lose its passion. And that is a very interesting phenomenon where the Messianic group could have power even when most people don't believe in the idea. And it's interesting, and I enjoy your insight to understand that this phenomena is universal. It's not Israeli. Maybe that helps us understand the Israeli enigma, the fact that it's particularly an Israeli enigma.
Okay, so now let's talk about the flip side of this Israeli coin. You also claim that the Israeli left has become less and less committed to the dream of socialism and more focused on the existential challenge of peace, or even on more mundane interests, day-to-day interests. Do you think it explains the demise of the left in contemporary Israeli politics, as peace negotiations have remained in the deadlock for the last 20 years?
Yes, so it's interesting. Just like the Six-Day War transformed the Israeli right, it also transformed the Israeli left. And until the Six-Day War, the Israeli left was mainly about different versions of socialism. This is something that not everyone knows. The founding fathers of Israel. I know I sound very American, the founding fathers, but this is, I don't know, I'm sorry, I'm not speaking that direct analogy to Brazil, but I think in Israel, we don't even have founding fathers, we have founding groups. Founding groups like the kibbutz movement is not even charismatic individuals, it's charismatic groups that were the founders of Israel. They were all they were socialists. And they thought that what Israel should stand for is the idea of solidarity of workers. That's what Israel should stand for. That's the movement that Israel should lead in the world. And then something happened. Socialism started to lose its charm in Israel. And in some way, I think it went like also, in Western civilization, socialism started to lose its charm. And also, you see, not only in Israel, but also in Israel, what people felt towards Russia back in the 1960s, 1970s, reflected on what they felt and what Russia represented. So Israeli soldiers going to the Six-Day War, fighting Arab armies, which were backed by the Soviet Union. They were a Soviet Union in some ways, some of them were proxies of the Soviet Union. So you can't fight Soviet-backed armies and still admire the Soviet Union. And you can't stop admiring the Soviet Union without being disenchanted by socialism. This is all a process that Israelis were disenchanted from socialism. And then in the 1970s, a new charismatic idea appeared that replaced socialism as the organizing idea of the Israeli left. And that idea was peace. Suddenly, there's a new utopia, a new vision that's exciting. Instead of solidarity between workers, solidarity between nations. And peace became an exciting idea. And the reason why the Six-Day War gave birth to the idea of peace is that suddenly for the first time in Israeli history, we have land that the Arab countries want. The Golan Heights in the north of Israel was land that Israel conquered in the Six-Day War in 1967. And the Syrians want back. That's a good thing. Now we have something they want. And the West Bank is something the Jordanians want back. And the Sinai Peninsula, and probably not Gaza Strip, but the Sinai Peninsula, that's something that the Egyptians want back. So finally, we have bargaining chips. And the peace movement was born, realizing, hey, if we play our cards right, we could reach a deal and make peace with these countries and end the state of war. So that was a very exciting new vision for the left. So I would even say that the left is having, if the idea of peace wasn't born, the left would have had a very serious vacuum of ideas, because when socialism was collapsing, nothing was there to replace socialism. And then the Six-Day War came, gave peace was an opportunity, and that, I would say, saved the left until the idea of peace broke down. This is something many people don't know. Israelis stopped believing that peace is possible in the Second Intifada. Most Israelis are disenchanted by peace. And that is just, it's because, and it's not because of the Second Intifada the first, I guess I should organize the history, right? So the first Intifada was resembled by Palestinians throwing rocks at soldiers and settlers. That's 1987. And it was a Palestinian uprising, which is a very powerful uprising, 1987. 2000, there was a second uprising, the second Intifada. And this, what resembled the second Intifada as opposed to the first one, wasn't Palestinians throwing rocks at soldiers. It was suicide bombers exploding in shopping malls and buses. So it's very, very different in nature. It wasn't a natural uprising. There were terrorist attacks, and it's hard to believe over 1,100 Israelis were murdered in these massive terrorist attacks. And the second Intifada caused many Israelis not to believe that peace is possible for a very simple reason. It's not only that the second Intifada was so violent, it was also, and mainly, the timing of the second Palestinian uprising. The second Palestinian uprising started in fall 2000, which means like 20 years ago exactly. Yeah. And it was 2 months after the conference in Camp David, where in the summer of 2000, Ehud Barak, which was Israel's prime minister, and Bill Clinton and Yasser Arafat, the representative of the Palestinian people, they met in Camp David in the US. And Ehud Barak, the Israeli prime minister, made Arafat an offer. And there's many questions what really happened there, but what's important is we Israelis, for our conversation, what's important is we Israelis interpreted it. They thought Barak made Arafat an offer, which is the most generous offer an Israeli leader would ever make a Palestinian leader. And Arafat refused. He never came back with a counter offer. And 2 months later, the second Intifada begins and bus starts exploding. So Israelis said, hey, we offered them peace and 1,100 Israelis die. Maybe peace is not possible. And maybe the narrative that our presence in the West Bank is the cause for violence, maybe it's a false narrative because this violence began after we offered to end our presence in the West Bank. So that's when the idea, so in a nutshell, peace replaced socialism. And the second Intifada broke the credibility of peace. And ever since then, the Israeli left is broken.
You refer to the Israeli left with two images, the one of the kibbutzim movement and the one of Shalom Achshav, or Peace Now.
Yes.
And both are grassroots movements. And my question for you is, where is the Israeli grassroots now? I mean, you see Avodah is shrinking. It has shrunk dramatically over the last 15 years. Meretz or other Israeli left parties haven't been able to replace or to fill in the vacuum of the left. So what happened to the left nowadays?
Yes. So the left, so after the second Intifada, after Israelis were completely disenchanted by peace, so a new paradigm was born that replaced peace. And this is the third time the left reinvents itself. Socialism loses its power, peace replaces it. Peace loses its power, and unilateralism replaces it. The idea, hey, we can't make a deal with the Palestinians, so let's just unilaterally leave the territories. And that was an exciting idea. And it was implemented in 2005 in Gaza. And if it would have been successful from Gaza, I assume most Israelis would have supported a unilateral withdrawal from Judea and Samaria from the West Bank. But most Israelis think that the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza was a failure. Because a year and a half after Israel leaves Gaza, Hamas, an Islamic fundamentalist terrorist group, takes over Gaza, and they start shooting rockets on towns that are on the periphery of Gaza. So Israelis were saying, hey, well, if they're shooting rockets on towns in the periphery of Gaza, if we leave the West Bank, they might shoot rockets on the towns on the periphery of the West Bank, and that's Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is very close to the West Bank. So I think that was like the last hit for the Israeli left that even peace doesn't work, unilateralism doesn't work. And ever since 2007, I would say, that was when like the left never found a new exciting idea that would replace unilateralism, that replaced peace, that replaced socialism. It's a vacuum of people. Always people think it's a vacuum of leadership. That the left needs a strong leader. I think they're wrong. I think it's a vacuum of ideology, of an idea. It needs a great idea, not a great leader. And that's what it's missing.
Okay, so speaking of ideas, the most thought-provoking aspect of your book is the attempt to frame the Israeli-Palestinian relationship as a catch, which demands a way out, rather than a problem that demands a solution. Yeah. And yours is a fairly optimistic take on a pessimistic statement I heard the last time I went to Israel back in 2015. A friend of mine said, there are problems to which there are no solutions, and we have to learn to deal with that. So could you please tell us what this catch is and how you propose to get away from it?
Okay. So this is, well, here's the catch. My assumption is when it comes to the future of the West Bank, when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Israeli right has this idea that if Israel leaves the West Bank, it's threatening its future. It's threatening our national security. The Israeli left has this idea that if Israel stays in the West Bank, it's threatening its future because it's threatening our national majority. You can't have a Jewish majority when you're controlling 2 million Palestinians. And I think if you listen to both arguments and you listen to both arguments with clarity, you can't not be persuaded by both of them. And that's what I truly think. I think that if Israel stays in the West Bank, it's risking its future. The problem is that if it leaves the West Bank, it's risking its future. That's the catch, right? Back in Joseph Heller's book that you've mentioned, that's the catch. When you have a problem and the solution only creates a similar problem, that's a catch. So I think, yes, let's call, so here's the question. How can Israel escape this catch? I think to do that, we have to reframe what we are looking for. I think we should stop solving the problem. And just by stopping to solve the problem, there's progress. And here's why. I think we are trapped in a false dichotomy. This is the following false dichotomy. The Israeli left always speaks about solving the problem, solving the problem. And the Israeli right, let's say represented by Bibi, speaks about managing the problem. Now, managing the problem means keeping things the way they are. In other words, freezing the status quo. Solving the problem means transforming the status quo. It means ending the problem. Now, are these really the two options? Now, obviously, this is a false dichotomy. I'll give you an example. We don't think about any problem in these kind of categories, that either we end the problem or we don't do anything about it. Like imagine we'll speak about a crime, right? Crime. So imagine somebody says we need to solve crime. We have to end the crime. There shouldn't be any more crime, which is an infantile way of thinking, right? Like there'll always be crime, right? Okay, but somebody says, okay, like there's this utopian vision of ending crime. And then the other side says we can't end crime, so let's not do anything about it. Obviously, those are not the options. Or if someone says, let's end car accidents because people died, it's not good, so let's end car accidents. And somebody has a plan of how to end car accidents. And then the alternative is, let's not do anything about it. These are obvious. It's obvious that these are false. This is a false dichotomy. When it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we think we have only two options, either to solve the conflict, which is, I think is unsolvable, like your friend told you, but the alternative is not to ignore it. That's the false dichotomy. We can't solve it, and still there's a lot we can do. What can we do? Well, when it comes to crime, we ask how do we shrink crime. When it comes to car accidents, we ask what are the smartest policies that will shrink the amount of car accidents. Let's ask that question. What kind of policies will shrink the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Will shrink it dramatically. And now that makes room for new ideas. So first of all, that's an important paradigm that's important for me to promote. Not ending the conflict, not managing the conflict, shrinking the conflict, not utopia and not being passive. Shrinking the conflict, which means actually treating the conflict the way we think about almost all our problems, not in a false dichotomy. Now, shrinking the conflict, there's a lot we can do to shrink the conflict for the following reason. There's so many things Israel can do on the ground, on the West Bank, that will do two things. They would dramatically shrink the amount of control that the Israeli military has on Palestinian population. And we could shrink, and that without injuring Israeli security. Like there's a whole chunk of control over Palestinians that can be removed without injuring Israeli security. So I say, let's move that tomorrow morning. Now, here's the interesting thing is, not only is the right against that, the left is against that. Because the left says all these moves, changes on the ground will do towards peace. The problem is that peace is not coming. So we're not doing anything on the ground. I think, ironically, the status quo parties in Israel are not only the right, but also the left. And that's an unspoken alliance between the right and left in Israel. Because if any movement on the ground depends on peace, it means peace that's not coming means no movement on the ground. So the myth of peace is actually freezing the status quo, just like the Netanyahu paradigm. So I think we need a strong, passionate center that breaks these paradigms and starts speaking about shrinking the conflict without and not being paralyzed by the expectation to end the conflict.
Sorry. So in your book, you have proposed two, let's say, suboptimal plans to break with Catch 67. The partial peace plan and the divergence plan. Could you please describe the basic foundations of both responses and why restructuring the conflict might be useful to move ahead? Yes.
So first of all, thank you for, I love the way you called suboptimal plans. Suboptimal, that's right, very, I think the way we think about life is always like when you're mature, you realize nothing is perfect and it's still worthwhile trying, right? Yes. And when it comes to politics, we like things to be perfect. I have a theory that where we sustain our infantile tendencies is in two places, in religion and in politics. That's where we need everything to be perfect. Yes, we accept lack of perfection, everything, but when it comes to religion, to God, and to politics, we need everything to be perfect. So like we're holding on to infantile tendencies that we have. It's a theory, it's a pet theory I have. I would like maybe that speaks to you later. I'll tell you, when I wrote Catch 67, I spoke about two plans. Let me speak about maybe the second plan. Maybe I can speak about both. So the first plan goes like this. Israel cannot reach a deal that will end the conflict with the Palestinians. It cannot. I don't know, do you think I should go into all the reasons why we can't reach that kind of a deal? Or let's just realize that there were 18 attempts to reach that deal and we failed every time. In 53 years, we're trying. So let's just, maybe we should change the paradigm. We can't end the conflict. And we can't end the conflict because what the Palestinians want from us is something that we can't, the Palestinians, like in Camp David, they wanted Palestinian refugees to come back to their homes. These are all these things that Israel just can't accept without risking its very existence. But when you look at the West Bank map, this is something that someone called Yigal Allon, an Israeli from the Labor Party after the Six-Day War. He was the first one to notice this. Now, the areas are highly populated by Palestinians are actually not needed strategically to guarantee the security of Israel. And almost miraculously, the parts of the West Bank that Israel needs to hold on to in order to protect its borders are empty. There's barely any Palestinians there. Like the Judean desert and the Jordan Valley, I won't go into it. Those are the parts which have strategic value and not many Palestinians. So it seems like it's very obvious what Israel should do. It should leave all the areas that are populated by Palestinians, and it could do that without taking any security risks, and not leave the areas which are not populated by Palestinians and are important for Israeli security. And as a result, Israel is secure and doesn't control the Palestinian people. Perfect. Let's just do that. There's a problem. There isn't one Palestinian in the world that would agree to that. Not one. Because that means that they only get roughly 80% of the West Bank and not 100% of the West Bank. And they said no to 96% of the West Bank when Ehud Olmert, Prime Minister Olmert, offered it. So why would they agree to 80%? So for Israel, that's optimal. A deal where Israel leaves 80% of the West Bank for the Palestinians and stays in it roughly 20%, maybe 15%, maybe it's 85-15. There's different questions on depends on how conservative you want to be when it comes to security. Let's say you want very conservative, let's say. So most Israelis would say, hey, that's perfect because we don't want to control the Palestinians. We don't want to be threatened by the Palestinians. The way out of that catch is to leave 80% of the land and to stay in 20% of the land. But there's no Palestinian that would ever agree to that. So if you want to solve the conflict, that's a plan that won't solve the conflict. So just not solve the conflict. Let's do something else. Instead of the equation of Israel leaves 100% of the West Bank, and as a result, there's a peace treaty like there was in Egypt, and with the Emirates and embassies, and we signed the end of conflict and no more demands from each other. So so that equation is 100% withdrawal for 100% peace. Okay. So how about we do 80% withdrawal for 80% peace? What would that look like? Maybe that would look like no embassies. Palestinians still demand that their refugees come back to Israel. I won't go into it. They still have demands from Israel. But it means ceasefire. It means great economic ties. It means that there probably will be some violence erupting every now and then because it's not end of conflict. It's partial peace. So here, if the classic equation is full withdrawal for full peace, how about a different equation? Partial withdrawal for partial peace. Let's be more, I'm an advocate for modest politics. Partial withdrawal for partial peace. So the Israeli left doesn't like that because we need the perfect peace. The Israeli right doesn't like that because we don't no withdrawal. But most Israelis that don't want peace and don't want all the land, what they want is not to control Palestinians without being threatened by Palestinians. That's the catch. That's an idea that enables us to escape the catch without solving the problem.
How do your proposals to address the Catch 67 deal with the underlying emotions of Israelis and Palestinians, namely fear and humiliation?
Yes.
Is it possible to minimize or to allay those sentiments?
Yes. So this is a very important point. There is research done about the psychological level of the conflict, where the dominant emotion that Israelis feel towards Palestinians, according to a lot of research, and it's all here, it's in the footnotes of my book, the dominant emotions that Israelis feel towards Palestinians is not hate. This is very important to understand. Most Israelis don't hate Palestinians. They feel something else. They're afraid of them. Most Palestinians don't hate Israeli Jews. They feel humiliated by them. So I mean, this is obviously a broad generalization. There are Israelis that do not afraid of Palestinians, and Palestinians are not humiliated. But in very broad strokes, when Israelis and Palestinians meet, the inner voice of the Israeli is like, I hope he's not going to hurt me. And the inner voice of the Palestinian is, who does he think he is, that he's patronizing me? And that's like inner voices. And it creates a cycle, a vicious cycle. It looks like this. Because the Israelis are so afraid of Palestinians, I'm Israeli, so I should take responsibility. We overcheck them in the airports, right? We overcheck them. There's checkposts. As a result, they feel humiliated. So my anxiety creates more humiliation. That humiliation creates a poisonous atmosphere that sometimes leads to violence that creates more anxiety. On the Israeli side, that creates more so it's a cycle. Now, this cycle on a national level, this is how it looks like. This cycle is one of the reasons why peace is not possible. Because Israelis, which are, I think for good reasons, afraid of Palestinian people, and doesn't want to take any risks. So that means we'll always want Israeli soldiers to be present in the Jordan Valley. That's how we can guarantee our security. Oh, and Israeli airplanes, fighting airplanes, to fly over the sky of future Palestine. Those are things that would guarantee Israeli security and relax Israeli anxiety. But can you imagine something more humiliating than that? If you're Palestinian, Israeli Air Force flying over your head, Israeli soldiers in your country in the Jordan Valley. Can you imagine? So a deal that would relax Israeli anxiety will trigger Palestinian humiliation. And any deal that will relax Palestinian sense of humiliation will create Israeli anxiety. So that's the psychological level. Here's something I didn't write in the book. I'm glad you're asking. The idea I just offered, how about a partial withdrawal for partial peace? That would enable that would give birth to a generation of Palestinians that don't experience Israeli military regime controlling their daily life. Because when they drive from one Palestinian town to another Palestinian town, the road is a Palestinian road. Israel is not there. Because we left, I want to remind you, the centers of the population. According to my partial withdrawal for partial peace plan. That doesn't solve the conflict. And so you have a generation of Palestinians that doesn't feel humiliation. Hopefully, if partial peace doesn't mean amazing, loving relationship, but it just means that there won't be violence, a generation of Israelis that did not experience terrorism will be born. And then hopefully that's a generation that can make peace. I think the best we can hope for is not to make peace. The best we can hope for is to create the generation that can make peace. To create a generation of Palestinians that do not feel humiliated and generation of Israelis that do not feel terrified. We can't make peace. Maybe we can create the conditions that will give birth to the generation that can make peace.
So as a final question, let me talk about those conditions. The implementation of a partial withdrawal for a partial peace formula demands not only a paradigm shift within Israel and Palestine, but also a whole new political coalition within both societies. So what are the prospects for the future of Israeli and Palestinian politics if both societies are to be prepared for such a bold and important step?
So I feel more comfortable to speak for Israel than for Palestine, but I'm very optimistic about Palestine. I'm one of the only people I know that is optimistic about the future of Palestine. But here's the reality. It's very hard to even imagine the Israeli politics post Netanyahu. It's hard to imagine because there'll be reshuffling of everything when Netanyahu goes. The Likud won't be Likud anymore. It will be very, very hard to imagine. What will it look like? It's even harder to imagine Palestinian politics after Abu Mazen, after Mahmoud Abbas leaves. That's really hard to imagine because They don't even have a system of how, it's very, very complicated. So when I speak to my Palestinian, so here's something we know. We know that Abbas's days are coming to an end, and we know that Bibi's days are coming to an end. I mean, even though these two guys, every time someone said this is their last days, they were always wrong. But both of them, it's within the next few years, they won't be here anymore. And how will the Palestinian politics be reshuffled and how the Israeli politics will be reshuffled, that will determine, can we move to ideological politics and identity politics to pragmatic politics, which is what I'm offering. But I think in Israel, there's a lot of, there's real forces for pragmatism. And here, let me just map out very briefly Israeli politics. So Yair Lapid, I don't want to bore our audience with such internal Israeli politics, but Yair Lapid is a leader of a very pragmatic party called Yesh Atid. Benny Gantz is a leader of a very pragmatic party called Kahol Lavan, called Blue and White. Within the Likud, there are very pragmatic forces. And within, if you know the difference between Naftali Bennett and Bezalel Smotrich, Bennett is much more of a pragmatist and Smotrich is more like evangelical. So if you map, and Lieberman is, so if you map out the forces that would be friendly to the politics of pragmatism in Israel, I think in a post-Bibi era, you might find that it has potential to be the majority. After Abbas goes, I can't speak for Palestinians, but I know personally grassroots Palestinian movements which are speaking the new language of pragmatism. The language of pragmatism, in a nutshell, is that the role of politics is not to create a perfect world. The role of politics is to minimize suffering and to make the world a better place, not a perfect place. And I think we might find a pragmatic, not a right, not a left, but a pragmatic coalition in Israel. And I hope on the other side we could find the forces of pragmatism. I think the move now with the Emirates is an important move, and Bahrain, and is an important move because it has the power on the long term to shift Palestinians from the politics of grand dreams and ideologies to the politics of pragmatism.
Micah, thank you so much for this insightful conversation. And I'll pass on the word to Malka to keep talking to you about the other questions that our youth has for you. Thank you.
I really enjoyed this conversation with you, Professor. Thank you.
You're going to keep enjoying the conversation. I'm going to bring a few people who have prepared their questions to you. Guilherme, thank you so much for being with us. Have a great rest of your Sunday. But now we're going to move on to a few different questions. I feel like we've been very inspired on the polarization topic. It's been suffering, like it's been a struggle for Brazilians right now. So first, I would like to invite Alexandra Nigri to make her first question here. It's very interesting what she's going to bring about polarization. Ale, are you there?
Yes, let me put the video on. Hi, Micah. Thank you for being with us. So about the hatred involved in polarization, I keep thinking about the possibility that political polarization is rising with such intensity because it's a new acceptable mask for many different types of hatred, maybe prejudices, that's been lying in this society already in a very fundamental manner, maybe. So in your opinion, how much of the hatred involved in polarization is actually related to the political arguments at stake, that is, from a rational understanding that people have of those arguments and the consequent emotional reactions, or how much of the polarization is completely irrational, being a hatred that actually comes from different types of structural prejudice underlying the society through history? And in this sense, how can we expect to act upon polarization?
So that's my first question, Micah. I'm gonna invite Laura to come up because I think it's the two things that they're asking are very similar. So Laura, can you bring up your question as well?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Micah, for being with us. I would like to ask you that in an interview that you gave for the Times of Israel, you said something interesting, that you said that a polarized world is a world that lost its curiosity, because curiosity, you said, it what cracks our world, it what opens what our world. And it remembered me a text from Amos Oz, written in his book, How to Cure a Fanatic, that he tells that in addition to curiosity, humor is also a powerful weapon against the fanaticism of ideas, and therefore the phenomenon of polarization. So I would like to know, in your opinion, what other tools besides curiosity and humor we can use as individuals or as a society to fight against polarization?
Malika, are there more questions, or should I address these two now?
Address those two. I think it's enough.
Yes, yes, it's enough. It's enough. So these are two very, very powerful questions. Like, what is polarization masking? If I'm a left winger and I meet a right winger and I hate him or her just for having those views, so is that somehow masking deeper hate? Or is it or is it just that you hate people for their views? That was the way I understand the first question. And the second question is, how do we heal this? These are two very interesting questions. What's the depth of the hates, and what are the powers that can help us heal? Those are two very, very interesting questions. I think when you see a phenomenon of political polarization, where people hate each other just because they have different political worldviews, and you ask the question, where does that come from? So I think what helps is seeing this as a global phenomenon, because in Brazil, you're experiencing high levels of polarization. And you're trying to remember, when was the last time that right-wingers hated left-wingers like they hate them today, and left-wingers hate right-wingers just because they're right-wingers? When was the last time? And it's hard to remember a time that's worse than today. But Americans are having it the same. Americans, they really have it bad when it comes to polarization. Then you go to England, and the British, the question of the Brexit really tore families apart. Then you go to Israel, and Israelis are going crazy. Yes, and yes. And when you realize that the phenomenon is universal, so you have to ask, okay, what's in the water? What's in the air? Why is it universal? Because you see, it can't be a coincidence. Like you might say, oh, in America, you might say a name of a politician, it's because of him. And in Brazil, you might say another name of a different politician. I don't want to get into trouble with so, and in Israel, you might say another name. You might blame people, or you might blame ideas. But that's a great coincidence that all over the world, you're experiencing polarization in parallel. It must be connected. And I think the only connection we have different leaders, different ideas. We all share social media, which means it's possible that Marshall McLuhan, the great Canadian philosopher, was right. What really shapes societies is not the message, it's the medium. We have a new medium, and it's changing our lives. And the reason why this new medium is changing our life is because the economics behind it. There's this great movie now, by the way, at Netflix. I highly recommend it. Social Dilemma. Malika, are you guys watching this movie?
Yes, we are. Actually, one of my questions was totally about that, because I watched it last week and I was astounded. I was like, oh my gosh, technology sort of ruined us somehow.
Great. This is very, very, I'm glad of your, oh my gosh, record, because it's very hard to see this. This great philosopher towards the end of the 1980s, he says, people never realize the medium, because we think, what's important? The message. if you speak about racism or liberalism or capitalism or socialism, ideas are important. Who cares if you speak about the idea on radio, on TV, on Facebook? What's important is the message. And McLuhan says, no, what shapes us is the medium. And that shift is really transparent, and that movie really makes it very clear. And the reason is the following. The industry behind social media is an industry that makes money out of, as Tim Wu, a great scholar from Columbia University, puts it, it makes money from attention. Tim Wu calls this the attention industry. It makes money from our eyeballs, from our concentrated attention. It sells our attention, and it makes money off our attention. He calls them the attention merchants. I think that's so powerful, the attention merchants. And Tim Wu asks, how much is Facebook and Google and companies that make money from selling human attention? How much are they worth? And they're worth much more than the biggest oil companies in the US. So that means that today, this is so interesting, human attention is worth more money than oil. So this is a new world where people manage to monetize attention. This probably has a good way to say it in Portuguese. The monetization of human attention. Now, once human attention is oil, so think about it. Oil has value, so oil companies are always trying to figure out better ways to drill into the ground and take oil from the ground. When human attention, which is in our minds, in our hearts, has value, so the attention industry will find ways to grab our attention. And this is why we're so polarized. Because the messages that we get on social media are messages that are designed not to inform me regarding the world, but they're designed for one thing only, to grab my attention. And guess what? Human beings have a psychological weakness that we are distracted easily by extreme ideas and by the ideas that confirm what we believe in anyway. So the algorithms will always send us to our directions ideas which are the more radical version of something that we already believe in. And we see those kind of ideas again and again. That transforms you, that changes you. So if I have right-wing tendencies, it'll make me more right-wing. If I have left-wing tendencies, it'll make me more left-wing. And as a result, technology is changing our societies. So my opinion is that political polarization doesn't mask other ideologies. I think it's just a reflection of new technologies. That's my opinion. And that's why I think we should have a very serious conversation about technology. It's kind of like, let me just, one analogy. In the 1950s, and I'm speaking, it's very possible that what I'm sharing now is true about Brazil, but this is about America. In the 1940s, 50s, 60s, the fast food industry was created. You know, McDonald's and yes. And people thought, hey, this is a great thing, like food, and it's yummy, you know, it tastes nicely, and it's cheap, and it doesn't, it's quick. So those are great advantages. Then like 10 years later, you have obesity and other very serious problems, health problems. And there was a health crisis. People realized, hey, fast food is creating a health crisis. Well, as Carl Neupart puts it, Carl Neupart, look him up, a very interesting guy. Carl Neupart puts it, 10 years ago, we were addicted, not to fast food, but the fast information. Is that interesting? That analogy. We had a fast food revolution. Now we have a fast information revolution.
But do you feel like we're
10 years later, we don't have a health crisis. We have a political crisis. So this is where we are. Fast food created a health crisis. Fast information is creating a democratic crisis. Yes, Micah.
Would you say that we're completely alienated somehow right now, or you feel like societies are a bit, I don't know, asleep to, I don't know, revolt in any way?
Yes. So I mean, after a few years of fast food, the slow food movement began. Where people started cooking their own food, very aware of what they eat. I propose a slow information movement where we meet the people that we talk about, and we read slowly, and we listen to each other, and we reconstruct what we lost, deep curiosity. This is just like the slow food movement started to balance the fast food industry. We need a slow information, which is, by the way, also very Jewish. Slow information, to read slowly, to talk to each other, to enjoy real human interaction. This is something that can happen in a community, that can happen in schools. So this is the real revolt. The real revolt. Protecting ourselves from attention industry is trying to grab our attention. As somebody puts it, the attention resistance. How does it look like? Slow information, making politics about face-to-face, making politics about ideas that takes you more than 2 minutes to put them out. And that is, so I know this sounds very, very crazy to go back to slow information. But I think this is what our life depends on, our ability to think, to focus, and to think deeply, and to practice curiosity. And curiosity, if I'll go back to the second question, curiosity is so natural to us, and it's robbed from us. And what is curiosity? Let me just say, there is a great feminist researcher, philosopher called Carol Gilligan. And she speaks about a term which I highly recommend to think about a lot. She calls it radical listening. Radical listening. Now think about those two words, because usually when you think about the word radical, what comes to mind is somebody shouting and protesting. What does it mean not to protest radically, but to listen radically? So this is how she puts it. To listen radically is when you meet someone that thinks differently than yourself. Our first impulse is to ask, why are they wrong? And to shift our impulse and to ask, why are they right? Just to ask that question. And it's to shift from judgment to curiosity. If you're a left-winger and you read a right-winger, our first thing we're going to do is be very judgmental. Oh, he's a right-winger. That probably means he's a fascist or whatever. Or if you're a left-winger, or if you're a right-winger, you see a left-winger, oh, he's not loyal, she's not, whatever it is, there's immediate judgment. The shift from judgment to curiosity. That's so interesting. He's a right-winger. I never met a right-winger. Like, just curiosity. That shift, that's what we need. We need to move from judgment to curiosity. That's radical listening. That doesn't mean agreeing. That doesn't mean accepting. It means enjoying our politics, because it's interesting. It means, so yes, we need to work hard on resurrecting curiosity and protecting ourselves from poisonous technology. I think that's how we heal the world. We need to think about how to protect ourselves from technology and how to resurrect curiosity.
I feel like going back to the streets for protesting is sort of old-fashioned now, right? In the way you're saying, I don't see like Brazilians getting out and going to the streets to make like a big difference in our country. This happened like 30 years ago when we got back on democracy after dictatorship. And I mean, people are not doing that anymore.
Yes, it's not. Also, there is a numbing effect of social media. It's a numbing effect. If I wrote a strong post, that's no, the street, anything that's physical, that's where transformation happens. Our brain can only transform and be transformed face to face, not through. It's for many people, politics became something very lazy. If you think you did something, on your screen, you did something. You see, the best usage of technology, of online technology, if it's in service of offline. Like, let's say if I use Facebook to get 200 people to get together, the real thing is 200 people getting together. And Facebook was in service of that. Or let's say WhatsApp, okay? If I use WhatsApp to meet a friend and then we meet, something happens. We bond, we connect, we feel each other. We look each other in the eyes. Something happens. So WhatsApp is a very powerful vehicle if it's in service of the real thing, and the real thing is offline. But here's when it becomes dangerous. When online is in service of the real thing, it's great. When you start believing that online is the real thing, it's dangerous. So online politics and service of the real thing is great. When you start thinking that's the real thing, that's when it numbs you.
Wow. I'm going to bring Naomi and Karina. They have very interesting questions about Brazilian society. I don't know how much you've heard about the chaos we're living in right now, but I guess they're going to bring up a few subjects on that.
I'm obviously very ignorant, but at the same time, I can't believe what you're going through. I can't believe it's hard for me to believe that the situation is so polarized and so poisonous in such a crazy way. And I feel, and I really want to learn.
So Naomi.
Hi, Micah. So let me ask. Besides this polarization context designed by with speeches and emotions to mass hatred, creating enemies, religion in Brazil is already structurally unequal and very violent towards the faith of religious groups of African origin. Brazil is the blackest country outside Africa, being 55% of the population. So intensify the political, racial, and social relationship between evangelical church, the fastest growing religious segment in Brazil, and Afro religions, by using cultural appropriation and symbols. Those religion more frequently to approach evangelical ministers to use a more white history and metrics, Israeli flag on several occasions. Meanwhile, Afro symbols and traditions are also used to express their hatred, racism, and even justify violent attacks on leaders, followers, and temples. How do you feel this reality, and what's your biggest concern about it?
So I don't know enough about this phenomenon in order to say anything really deep and profound. All I could say is that from my experience in Israel, in trying to bridge gaps, ideological gaps, religious gaps, so we always have a tendency to see the worst of the other group as the representation, the authentic representation of the other group. And every group always sees its best version as its authentic representation. And usually that breaks when people meet face to face. When people meet face to face, they are somehow deluded from the illusion that their best version is their authentic version, and also that the other side's worst version is the real thing, is the authentic version. So I think you're living in a world where the politics of hatred is also the politics of stereotypes. And I feel bad that Israel, as a symbol and as a flag, is a part of this poisonous political environment. I feel bad about that as an Israeli. But there's nothing I could do about that, because my symbols and my language is out there for people to grab and for them to use and to turn into metaphors and symbols in their own service. So, but all I could say is that the algorithm of social media is very friendly to those tendencies. Is very friendly. And one of the reasons is there was a research done about human emotions and what emotions are more viral. And to remind you, something that's viral is something that produces income for the attention industry, because if it's viral, it grabs attention. And out of all human emotions, what's the emotion that's most viral? Not love, not awe, not aesthetically appreciation thing, but expressions of rage are more viral. It's something about our human condition that rage captures our attention. And since the algorithms of Facebook already noticed that rage is something we're attracted to, so in our news feed, most of our posts are, with high proportion of our posts that we read, that we're exposed to, is rage. So a lot of our political rage, it's hard to believe, is manufactured by algorithms. So again, I know I'm a broken record, this has to be said again and again, that a lot of our problems are because human beings are not creating the environment for our political conversation. It's AI, it's artificial intelligence, it's algorithms in service of an attention industry that's shaping our conversation. And guess what? When human conversations are not organized by humans, the conversation itself is less human. Naomi, I know I didn't address your question directly. Excuse me, I apologize. I feel I don't know enough to go directly deep into the poisonous atmosphere created now in Brazil.
Just a fun fact, not really a fun fact, but you said you wanted to learn, but it's very interesting how cultural appropriations are going on in Brazil. One of the largest churches in Brazil is called Universal. Its leader, he's called Edir Macedo. He's actually the owner of one of the largest broadcasters in Brazil, that is gaining a lot of money from the government right now. But he now dresses as a rabbi pretty much. It's an evangelical church. He wears a kippah. He goes around with his talit, and he wasn't even like that like 10 years ago. They sort of found like this new appropriation of history, to sort of like go directly, Jesus, Israel, the Jewish people are the chosen ones. Just so you can imagine, there is this large temple in the center of São Paulo, and he imported rocks from Jerusalem to build this temple.
Wow. Wow.
So this is how embedded we're in. So, I mean, right now, the Jewish community is not really like hated by any group. It's actually very loved by evangelicals. And that's what Karina is going to talk about in her question.
Thank you, Micah, for being with us today. So my question is, I don't know if you know, but Brazilian political polarization also ended up embracing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So basically, if you are right-wing in Brazil, you must love and support Israel unconditionally. And if you are leftist in Brazil, you must hate Israel because the country represents imperialism in the 21st century. So leftist Zionists are seen as aberrations. Like the rightists see them as Israel traitors, and the leftists see them as occupation supporters. And that is not in the Jewish community, but in the society in general. Right-wing demonstrations carry Israeli flags and left-wings Palestinian flags. So as an Israeli, what is your view on polarization in Brazil regarding the appropriation of an issue that has nothing to do with local politics, such as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
It's insane. We know.
Right? No, it's not the first time it's happened. It's interesting. Also in Northern Ireland, there was a tendency which every side, it's very interesting. I want to look at it from a different direction. For some reason, Israel has a tendency to capture world attention, not only in Brazil, but all over the world. The reason why so many journalists serve in Israel is because people all over the world are very curious about Israel. I remember going to Spain a few years ago, and the Spanish cab driver was asking me questions about Bibi. So I asked him, if I was Lebanese, would you know who my prime minister is? If I was Cuban, would you know who my prime, like, so what is it about Israel that grabs the attention of the world? That's a great enigma, because Brazil is not alone here. It's a very extreme what you're describing, but it's not alone here. And I don't know the answer to that question, but I should tell you something as an Israeli, and I tell this to my students. There's something that as Israelis we don't know, and that is that the world is always looking at us. For some enigmatic reason, the world is curious about what we are doing. And that means that our behavior has implications that goes beyond, that are not local. It's kind of like you wake up one morning and you realize that your life is on stage. You know the Truman Show? Right? As long as he realizes, hey, everybody's watching my life, like he realizes that. So that's something Israelis don't know. Everybody's watching their lives, everything. And that's something I like to explain to Israelis. The world is watching. It's not a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's just a thing. It's a fact. Like right now, you gave me ammunition. I was like, you know that in Brazil, how crazy this is, that right-wingers have Israeli flags and left-winger policy. It's really, so I'm not offended by cultural appropriation. I feel like I have a responsibility. The fact that the world is watching Israel, as an Israeli, I want to say, it means that Israel has the power to make a difference in the world. Because if we are able to deal with this almost impossible situation of Israelis and the Palestinians, and if we can somehow reorganize this, deal with this in a smart, compassionate, sophisticated, and ethical way, the world is watching. And if we screw it up, the world is watching. So we have the power to make a difference in a level which is universal by dealing with an issue which is very particular. And that is something that I find what you're sharing with me is creating much more responsibility and leaving much more weight on our shoulders, ours meaning Israelis.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, we've been very bothered by the fact that a few months ago, not really right now, we were having like tons of manifestations around the streets. People were gathering, protesting. And most of the time when we were watching the right-wingers, for instance, they were carrying Israeli flags together with the United States flags and some Brazilian ones. It was a very interesting mix. But I would say that the Jewish community is getting like a little bit worried about how we're being put in this context that it doesn't even represent us. But well, I'm gonna turn this around a little bit. We're gonna get back to Israel. You have another Israeli here on Zoom. So Itai, do you want to come up with your question?
Yes. Hi, Micah. Thank you for being here with us today. So about Israel again, I want to know what do you think about this issue, if the growth of the religious right is related with the empowerment of part of the population that was not being heard by the socialist left before. Is the division between Ashkenazim, Jews that the families came from Europe, and Mizrahim, Jews that came from the Arab world, is this a factor for the polarization, and if it's still relevant?
So this is a very good question, Itai, and I find this very puzzling. Let me just try to give some background to the people who are with us today. There's many ways. How do you divide Israel? And there is a tendency to divide Israel between European Israelis meaning Israelis that came to Israel, immigrated from European countries and the US, and Russia. It's European in the very, very broad sense. And people that Middle Eastern Israelis that are actually more native. They immigrated within the Middle East, to the Middle East, from Morocco, from Kurdistan, from Iraq, from Egypt, from Syria. And in the first generations, in the 1950s, it was very clear that the European Israelis had the power, and they were the one that accepted the non-European Israelis into Israel. And not all the time, but some of the times, part of the process was trying to Europeanize them, make them more secular, make them more, try to. And then in the 1970s, 1980s, there was an awakening among Sephardi Jews, Mizrahi Jews coming from Arab countries, and they felt like they were taken advantage of in the 1950s, and that created a lot of the political energy that was clashing in Israel. And now that's a polarization I didn't speak about. So Itai is asking, is that polarization between Ashkenazi Jews and Mizrahi Jews, European Jews and Jews that came from Arab countries, is that polarization somehow fueling the right-left polarization? So that's, if I understand, Itai, that's your question.
Yeah, that's my question, yes.
And here's an enigma. On the one hand, 3 generations into Israel, most European Israelis don't have an awareness of the European Israelis. They're Israelis. And most Mizrahi Israelis, most of my Moroccan friends are not Moroccan in their identity. They're just Israelis. 3 generations later, there's a lot of mixed marriage. It's blurred. And yet, even though these identities are not strong individual identities, they're still strong political identities. So this is, first of all, an enigma in Israel. How is it that 3 generations later, with most Ashkenazim don't feel Ashkenazim, most Mizrahim don't feel Mizrahim as individuals, not for everyone, but for most Israelis, those identities lost their power, but in politics, they're powerful as ever. Why is that? It's interesting. It's an enigma. Why is that? So my take is that we used to have 2 very strong ideologies, ideology of land and ideology of peace. Both ideologies collapsed. And this has to do with a larger phenomenon, and which I think is also generated by social media, is that what replaced the politics of ideologies is the politics of identities. Where you feel like, what is politics about? Politics is not about solving problems, which is what I think. It's about expressing identities. And when politics is about expressing identities, so all these dormant identities come back to life and they get a life of their own. So this would be a good way. I realize we have to start wrapping up, right, Malcolm? So your question is a good way for me to also start summarizing some of my ideas. Is that when ideologies collapse, it was replaced with identities. And I think it should be replaced not with identities, but with policies, with pragmatism. We're not about big ideas anymore. And we should be about pragmatism and not about all these identities, because I'm for identities. I'm for expressing your identities, but express your identity in culture, in philosophy, in religion, in the synagogue, not in politics. Politics is not for expressing identities. Politics is about solving problems. The problems are big, and we need to solve them in a smart way, not in a way that reflects my identity. Politics is about how to suffer less, not about how to express myself more.
Well, can I ask one last question? Can we fit in?
Yes, of course.
So I'm a conservative Jew. So I read about Midrashet Prat. It's dedicated to secular Israelis. And I wanted to know how this mix is functioning right now, and the political views. I mean, people have very different political views because you have a mix. So how does it work in this environment?
So Midrashet Prat, or Beit Prat, we call it now Beit Prat. It's for religious and secular Israelis in their 20s after the army. And we have more than 3,000 students. And I wouldn't say that they're a reflection of their generation, but they are a sample of the generation. And what you realize is that I think most Israelis are not so polarized. And this is something that I try, Israelis are not that polarized in the sense that, and here is an insight about Israel. And that is that secular religious Israelis feel very close to each other. Most secular Israelis feel close to religious Israelis. Most religious Israelis feel close to secular Israelis. Most right-wing Israelis feel close to left-wing Israelis. In Israel, we have the following paradox. Our politics is very divided, while the country is not divided. And that's interesting because Brazil, it seems like the country is divided, and that's why your politics are divided. The politics is a reflection of the country. In America, this I could speak with much more authority than America. America is divided. And the division in politics is a reflection of a divided country. In England, they're divided. They have different understandings of what England is, and the polarization in politics is a reflection. In Israel, the country is not that divided anymore, but the politics is more divided than ever. So that's the paradox of Israel, which I experience every day.
About the political chaos in Israel right now, what's your guess?
The political chaos in Israel. I mean, I don't want to go into so much detail of this. But this is. There's two options. It's very possible that Israel will enter a fourth cycle of elections. Which, can you imagine? Israel is facing, like the rest of the world, a health crisis, which is triggering, like the rest of the world, an economic crisis. But in its background, we have a political crisis. That's unique. Like, our political system is not functioning. We don't have a budget, it's not functioning. So so there's no governing in Israel now. So that's a big deal. Like, when three crises hit each other, that's, it's hitting the fan. So it's very possible we might hit our fourth election. But there's always ways out. Things could surprise. There could be surprises. But Israel is very much controlled by one person. The Israeli political system is controlled by one person, by Netanyahu. And Israeli politics is always about playing the guessing game. What does Bibi want? What does Bibi want? What does Bibi want? And I'm not sure Bibi himself knows what he wants today. So it's hard to get. What?
Okay, Micah, thank you so much for your time with us. I enjoyed a lot. Hope we're gonna talk to you again in some time. And good luck on the next steps in Israel. I know we need luck here in Brazil.
Luck, yes, we all need luck.
So we see you next time. Thank you so much.
Great. I hope first of all, thank you all so much. I hope that this conversation helped keep politics less terrifying and more interesting. That's how we heal the conversation, make it interesting. I hope this was interesting.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Done?
Muito bem, gente. Parabéns.